G'day and welcome to another gun review video on my channel. Now, a little while ago, probably about a year ago, I put out a video on my Ithaca Flues double barrel shotgun, American made shotgun. That one was made in 1919. Anyway, a little while ago, I was looking at actually the same auction site where I bought that Ithaca. And lo and behold, there's another American gun is advertised, and I wasn't really in the market for another gun, but I put in a very low cheeky bid, and amazingly I won it, $400. So I think that's about 280, something like that, $260, $280 US. And for that amount of money, I got this. This is a Parker Brothers Trojan. I was aware of the general American shotguns from back in the day. I knew the names, even though I hadn't really ever seen them. So, as I said, I've got an Ithaca, but I was aware of Parker Brothers. And I knew that Parker Brothers were almost iconic in the US. So, I was surprised to actually be able to pick up a really nice Parker Brothers shotgun for that tiny amount of money. So this is actually a Parker Brothers Trojan, so it's actually the sort of budget, we'll put budget in inverted commas, model from Parker Brothers from back in the day. Now looking at the serial number, this one exactly the same year as my Ithaca, made in 1919. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about Parker Brothers, their history, their guns, and then we'll have a bit of a closer look at this Trojan. So I'm going to get it out of the way just so I don't have to keep dealing with it while we're talking. Let's just put it there. And Parker Brothers actually has, even if you're not really into shotguns, it actually has a pretty interesting history which is directly linked to the US Civil War.
The founder of Parker Brothers was Charles Parker, who was born in Cheshire, Connecticut on January the 1st in 1809. He was a sixth generation descendant of William Parker.
So William Parker was one of the Massachusetts colony's earliest English settlers. He established himself in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then in 1636, along with 120 others and led by Thomas Hooker, he went on this migratory expedition through the wilderness to settle the Hartford, Connecticut area. So the Parker family is one of the sort of Connecticut's founding families. Charles's father, Stephen, fought in the American War of Independence. He served 3 militia enlistments between May 1777 and December 1780. And he fathered 12 children to 2 wives. Most of the children died in childbirth. But as I said, Charles was born in Cheshire, Connecticut in 1809. In 1831, Charles married Abby Lewis Eddy, and that marriage lasted until her death in 1880. They had 10 children, but only 5 lived to maturity. In 1832, Charles purchased an acre of land in Meriden, Connecticut, and he started his first iron foundry. He was making coffee mills and waffle irons. So Charles and one labourer, along with a blind horse hitched to a sweep pole as a power source. Now, he gradually expanded his business and was a very hard worker. Apparently he used to work up to 15 hours a day every day. So as his business has expanded, he made tools, tableware, cups, lamps, piano stools, housewares. And he actually installed the first steam engine in the area in 1844. Once he became very successful in his manufacturing businesses, he actually started developing more manufacturing businesses. At one stage, apparently, he had five. He either had or he was involved in 5 different factories of different businesses. So, in 1854, he went into partnership with a company called Snow, Brooks and Company, and they built a foundry and factory on Cherry Street next to the railroad tracks. So this business was making steam engines, pumps, gears and other heavy industrial components. And they obviously did quite well. And then in 1861, Charles Parker bought the controlling interest of the other partners in this company, Snow and Brooks. In 1861, the company got a government contract to supply 15,000 Springfield pattern rifle muskets. Until then, they had no experience in producing firearms. This was their first firearms contract. And one thing that's worth mentioning about Charles Parker, I read this in a few different things I read about him, is he was very good at finding the right people to do the job, and then when he found them, he basically made it such that they couldn't say no. He was very generous in his offering someone a work package in order to get their knowledge and skill into his production process. It was always such that it was so much better where they already were that they would come and work for him, and then he must have treated people so well that people worked for him and for the Parker Brothers company for generally their whole careers for decades. And that's probably one of the reasons why their product just became held in such high regard. So the company employed a pair of brothers, William and George Miller, their names were. They had a couple of decades experience in firearms manufacturing companies in the New England area. They were highly experienced and highly skilled. And William was put in charge of the rifle production, and George Miller was put in charge of the lock production of the locks, of the rifle locks. They completed this contract for 15,000 Springfield pattern rifle muskets. I'll show you one of those muskets now. In December 1864, Charles Parker renamed the Cherry Street operation the Meriden Manufacturing Company because obviously the other partners were no longer involved in the company anymore, so he obviously just wanted to change the name to not reflect those names. And also remembering that it wasn't actually a gun company, it was a general manufacturing company that had got a contract to make these guns. So they finished that contract. In 1865 the war ended and the factory still had all this major gun manufacturing infrastructure. So there was a low demand for rifles at this point because there was just literally millions of surplus rifles because cartridge firing rifles kind of came in during that Civil War period. All these muzzle loading rifle muskets were obsolete and you could be bought very cheaply, so there was a very low demand for new rifles. On December 6, 1864, Lewis Triplett of Columbia, Kentucky was granted a patent for an improvement in magazine in self-loading arms.
The patent was filed by Lewis Triplett, but the rifles later became known as the Triplett and Scott because there was another man called Scott who kind of had some political connections and lined up the adoption of the rifle by the Kentucky militia, and also may have had some financial contribution to enabling the patent.
At this point, the company was still called Parker Snow and Company. They hadn't changed the name to Meriden. Parker Snow and Company made these repeating rifles for the 1864 government trials. However, they did poorly in the sand test when they were, had sand poured on them, they jammed them up. So in January 1865, Parker Brothers received a contract from the state of Kentucky and by this stage the company's name had changed to the Meriden Manufacturing Company, and so that's what the rifles are marked, as you'll see. And they made 3,000 rifles at $30 each, and 2,000 carbines carbines at $22 each, and they were chambered in 5650 Spencer rimfire, so the same cartridges in the Civil War Spencer rifles, a rimfire cartridge. After that contract was finalised, but they still had the production line up and running, they did make a small number of sporting rifles chambered in the 44 Henry rimfire. So they're really interesting, these Triplett Scott rifles. They would have been, I mean, they never actually saw service, but they're still sort of considered one of these range of unusual Civil War era early cartridge repeating, or not even repeating cartridge rifles. There's a couple of quite good videos on YouTube actually showing the function of the rifle, because it's a really unusual thing. So I'll link them up here one at a time.
In 1865, William Miller took out a patent for a conversion system for converting muzzle-loading rifle muskets into breech-loading rifles. The conversion was shown to the US government, who gave them a contract for 5,000 rifles. All the ones known are actually built on Parker Snow marked rifles, so the government must have collected up a lot of these rifles and gave them back to the Meriden Manufacturing Company to do the conversion with. Of course, it was the Allen system of conversion that was adopted by the US government to produce what we now know as the trapdoor Springfield, but William Miller sued Colonel Benton of the Springfield Armory for patent infringement because the extractor on the Allen conversion is very similar to the Miller extractor, which was actually patented first. Ian McCollum over at Forgotten Weapons has an excellent video on the Miller conversion, although he doesn't seem to realise that Parker Snow and the Meriden Manufacturing Company are the same company. I'll put a link up the top and also in the description for you to watch that.
In 1865, Charles Parker contracted the Meriden Manufacturing Company to start producing a sporting double-barrel shotgun. This shotgun was designed by William H. Miller. So these first guns, there was only about 700 of them, were marked, made by the Meriden Manufacturing Company for Charles Parker. So they were kind of the first guns in the Parker Brothers lineage of guns, but they weren't actually Parker Brothers guns. So William H. Miller designed this shotgun in 1866. Very unusual sort of action. They had like a T-shaped lifter in front of the trigger guard, which was pushed up in order to open the action.
This is a backlock example of one of those early guns.
And I read somewhere that it's thought that the barrels for these early guns are actually made from surplus rifle musket barrels that were left over from the Civil War contract. 724 is the highest serial number that's known, so only about 700 or so were made. In 1868, Miller modified this T-latch. They went through several designs in shotguns, using both front and back action locks in the guns, because these are all hammer guns, of course. I didn't mention that, so we're talking about hammer guns at this stage. In 1867, Charles Parker was named the first mayor of Meriden.
As Charles Parker's first sporting guns were so successful, he started a new company with his three sons, William, Charles Eddy and Dexter, and he was obviously intending for them to take on the running of the company in the future, and thus he called the company Parker Brothers.
At that time, Charles Parker had multiple businesses and factories. His total turnover was over $2 million at that time, which equates to approximately $42.5 million today. During this period, Charles decided he needed to find some more specialist in shotgun making if he was going to keep developing a shotgun line. So he actually employed a man called Charles King. Now, he had been working as an engineer at Smith & Wesson. And so he came over to Parker Brothers, and he actually modified this old T-shaped Parker Brothers design into a modern top lever design, as we're sort of used to today with the top lever, and created the first sort of Parker Brothers, what we now know as an early Parker Brothers hammer gun. So just talking about this Charles King, he was instrumental in developing the Parker Brothers design. He worked at the company until 1908, and when he retired as superintendent, but he was succeeded by his son Walter A. King. Now, and when they changed in 1882, when they changed over to this top lever design, because this lifter design with the T-shaped lifter in front of the trigger guard was kind of iconic and known in Parker Brothers gun, there was still a demand for it, so they continued making the two designs side by side. But as the years went by, they made less and less of this lifter type, and the last lifter gun was made in 1907. And Charles passed away at age 93 on January the 31st, 1902. Now, a recognisable feature of Parker guns, I'll just grab this one again for you, and we'll show you. See this, most double barrel shotguns will have a hinge pin here, which is either, sometimes it will have a cover on it, or it will be, the hinge pin will just be filed down and finished to be kind of the same level as the rest of the receiver. But as you can see in this Parker gun, they have this recess with the hinge pin in it. Now that started in 1878 and went right through to all subsequent Parker Brothers shotguns had that, as you'll see in all the other photos I'm going to show you shortly. Now, the other thing that was introduced, designed by Charles King, and it was called the King's Patent. Now, so that he did design a 4-end latch for the Parker Brothers gun, which was in all Parker Brothers guns from then on right through until they finished. There's a UK patent given to someone called Dealey. Now, you might have heard of it, box lock action, English box lock actions. Anson and Dealey was sort of one of the very first and most popular designs, but this Dealey, this British gun designer, also designed a 4-end latch, and it's very similar. So
here's a King's patent latch on a Parker gun, and here's a Dealey patent latch on an English gun.
So as you can see, they look the same, and they basically, I mean, I think maybe the internals are slightly different, but basically you've got a little lever that you can get your tip of your finger under and pull down, which actually opens a latch and allows the 4-end to come off the barrels. In 1888, King actually acquired every high quality English and American hammerless gun that he could get his hands on, and he looked at all the positives and the negatives of these guns, because what he wanted to do was basically design the ultimate double barrel shotgun, hammerless double barrel shotgun. So he lodged 2 patents in 1887 and then another one for a barrel stop. Now, compared with the Anson and Dealey box locks, which I just mentioned a minute ago, the unique features of King's Parker Brothers patent was they had bell crank hammers, I'm not exactly sure what that means, where the cocking is activated by the falling barrels. The hammers had the firing pins actually on the hammers, integral to the hammers. The hammers are driven by coil springs, unlike most English guns, which were still using leaf springs. The hammers were rebounding. The Parker gun had an automatic safety on the tang introduced, which is basically what we know today. Almost every shotgun you buy today will, when you open the barrel and then close it up again, you'll have to push the safety because it's been automatically put on. And the barrel lug is on a movable linkage. Again, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but that was one of the unique features of the of the Parker Brothers box lot. So as the years went by, again, just like with the T-lifter guns, after the introduction of the top lever guns, they continued making them and then they gradually phased them out. It was the same with hammer guns versus hammerless guns. So when they introduced the first hammerless guns in 1888, they continued making hammer guns, external hammer guns alongside them, and then they gradually, the hammerless gradually eclipsed the hammer guns. So around 6,000 hammerless guns were made between 1888 and I think it was again about I think it might have been like 1902 or 1907 when finally they stopped making the hammerless, the external hammer guns. There was another gun designer that was employed about the same time as Charles King. His name was Hayes. I'll find his first name for you. And in 1901, King and Hayes together patented a design for selective automatic ejectors on their guns. And then after that, the higher grade of guns automatically, came with automatic ejectors, and the slightly lower grade guns, they became optional, so you could actually order a gun with or without ejectors. Something else that's worth mentioning is in 1905, another design, Parker design, which became kind of ubiquitous in Parker guns, was that the barrel locking lug hardened steel plate was introduced.
If we have a look at the locking recess of this gun, can you see where there's like a T-shaped insert in the bottom of the locking recess? And you can see it's actually a wedge-shaped locking recess. So obviously as that wears, it's designed so that it won't wear too quickly, and so as it wears a little bit, then the locking bolt will go in a little bit further and keep the gun locked. But then eventually when it gets to the stage where it's worn right down so that the locking bolt's not locking it properly. Back in the day, good shotgun gunsmiths would have a supply of these replacement recesses, and you could actually take your gun off to a gunsmith and they would remove that little hardened locking wedge and then replace it with a new one, and then your gun would be ready to go again.
Then in 1910, Hayes actually simplified the locking mechanism of the gun, reduced the number of parts in it. For 30 years, the Parker gun, I think they decided that they basically perfected the Parker gun and they didn't change. As you know, in the early 1930s, the Depression hit, and Parker guns were never cheap. The higher grade guns were probably the equivalent of spending tens of thousands of dollars now, and even the lower grade guns were not the sort of thing the average person could just buy. So the Trojan was designed to try to solve that, but even the Trojans were, compared to the incomes of the day, were expensive. So when the Depression hit in the early 1930s, Parker sales went down because people just couldn't afford them, and Parker kind of got into financial difficulty, and in 1934 the company was sold to Remington. So Remington actually took over the Cherry Street Meriden manufacturing facility. So I think Remington bought the business and they probably leased the premises initially, and they continued producing guns at the Parker Brothers facility, and they produced another 5,957 guns in the 8 years that they continued manufacture. And the guns were exactly the same as all the previous Parker guns. The only difference was, instead of having Parker Brothers, let's have a look at this and see if you can see that. Hopefully you can see that from there. Parker Brothers, they had the Parker gun marked on them. There was no mention of Remington, and there was no Parker Brothers on the side like you just saw, but they had the Parker gun either on the side of the action, or some of them had just Parker on the bottom of the action just behind the fore end. Yeah, so one thing I haven't sort of mentioned is that Parker guns in the United States now are highly collectible. You know, the higher the grade, the more collectible they are and the more expensive they are, but they're highly collectible. And of course there's all these different types of Parker guns. There's the pre-Parker, so the big Parker collectors probably have, you know, the pre-Parker Merited manufacturing guns. They have the early Parker Brothers T-lock, T-lifter guns. They have the early hammer guns. They have and then all the other guns after that. And then of course now there's these Remington made guns which are just as good as every other Parker. There were 5,957 guns produced by Remington in 8 years. So for 3 of those years were they produced in the Cherry Street Meriden factory. In December 1937, Remington closed the Cherry Street factory and moved all their machinery, inventory of parts, but only 20 of the mid-level workers decided to move. Most of the others were pretty old and probably didn't want to move, and so just retired at that point.
Parker guns continued to be made in Remington's Ilion factory until 1942, when production has stopped so that the workers could transition over to wartime production.
Now, during the years after this, they probably still had a lot of inventory of parts and partially finished guns and all that. And apparently the odd gun, whenever a retiring senior DuPont, must be that DuPont must have actually owned Remington at this point. You know, the gun companies are always getting bought and sold. But apparently I read somewhere that whenever a retiring senior DuPont or Remington kind of management type official retired, the workers were put, you know, the skilled workers obviously were put to, they probably just got a semi-finished gun out of their inventory that would just been sitting there for years, and they finished the gun and they were presented with a Parker gun. So that was pretty interesting. But after the war they didn't restart production. Now you've probably heard of the Sharps rifle. They're a famous single shot rifle from the kind of West era. They were used in shooting buffaloes. And Christian Sharps actually named his rifle Old Reliable. But when the Sharps company went bankrupt in 1876, Charles Parker started advertising his shotguns as Old Reliable, and they've been known as that like to this day. That's where the name comes from. Any decent Parker in the US would be a very good investment. Now, in general, like anything, the kind of rare or more unusual items demand a higher price. When I did my article on Ithaca flues, we talked about that at that time all the shotgun manufacturers sold their guns as different grades of gun, and grading reflects the finish, the amount of engraving, the quality of the wood. In Parkers, as we've talked about, the type of steel that's used in the barrels, whether or not they have ejectors, and the really high grades of course have gold inlay and that sort of thing. The higher grade guns are always going to be worth a lot more to collectors. They're going to be worth a lot more in general. They will cost a lot more when they were purchased. The other thing that contributed to kind of rarity was the bore size. Of course, 12 bore in America was always the most common. So 12 bore guns in any grade are going to be more common than others. Then the other grades, 20 is probably the second most common. Back then 16 was reasonably common. But the smaller bores, 28 and 410, and they even made them in 10. I think some were even made in 8 gauge. So those much bigger or much smaller bore guns were a lot more valuable to collectors because there's just a lot less of them around. So yeah, so after the war, when Parker guns were no longer made and people started collecting them, those were the ones that were the most sought after. In 1984, so we're talking kind of 40 years after the last, almost after the last Parker guns, you know, were Parker production guns were produced, shall we say. A A businessman named Tom Scouse looked into the possibility of making reproduction Parker guns. Tom was a businessman who owned a company called White Flyer Targets. They actually made clay targets, which he bought from the Olin Corporation, who owns a lot of other gun businesses, including the Winchester brand name. Tom learned that Winchester Olin had a relationship with a factory in Japan called the Codensha factory, where they had Japanese manufacturing the Winchester Model 23 side-by-side shotgun and 101 over and under shotgun. And when he had some contacts. When he made some inquiries, he found that the factory actually had extra capacity. So he negotiated with Codensha. He put a D-grade, mid-grade Parker gun in his luggage and flew to Japan with it and went to this shotgun factory. And the technicians there reverse engineered every part. He actually obtained permission from Remington to use the Parker name. Whether he had to pay for that or not, I'm not sure. But due to US import laws, the gun, even though Winchester itself, the Winchester Gun Company, which is owned by Olin, actually had nothing to do with the production of this Parker reproduction gun, because of US import laws, to bring it into the US, it had to be brought in sort of under Winchester's import license, because they were bringing in their other shotguns from this factory. So the guns are actually marked Parker Reproduction by Winchester. So, which is sort of funny because they're not actually anything to do with Winchester, but that's just the way they're marked. Now, these were predominantly made as small bores, as I just said, because they are the most highly sought after Parkers or shotguns, collectible shotguns in general. So if they're going to be selling them, they may as well be making them in small bores. All of the barrels the guns were made in their entirety at the Codensha factory, except for 16 bore barrels were made by Krieghoff in Germany, because 16 bore was still quite a popular size in Germany, so it obviously worked it out cheaper just to buy these barrels already made from a high quality gun barrel manufacturer than to try to start themselves. So all of the guns are actually marked Parker on the barrels, except for the 16 gauge, which were made by Krieghoff, because they don't have Parker or Winchester marks on them. By late 1988, 12,225 guns had been imported into the US to be finished. Soon after they were brought in, I don't know exactly what year, all the records and inventory were kept down in Florida, I think it was, and a hurricane came and flooded the actual facility where they were kept and destroyed the records and the inventory. So only a percentage of the 12,225 guns that were imported into the US were actually finished. No one knows exactly how many, but if you just Google Parker reproduction, there's always quite a few of them seem to be for sale in the US. So there must have been some thousands of them actually made.
While reproductions of most valuable items aren't considered to be as good as the originals, the way that these guns were made and the quality to which they were built means that Parker collectors actually consider them genuine Parkers in a lot of ways, although they're a specific niche in the Parker collecting community.
They're just really considered another chapter in the Parker story. So it just goes to show how, obviously these guns wouldn't have been cheap when they sold them, and it just goes to show how much esteem the Parker guns had, that they could actually make such a high quality, expensive reproduction and still actually sell them.
In 2006, Remington announced a limited production run of the Parker gun. Now, only one grade was available, and they were only available in a limited number of the small gauges, and I'm not sure how long this went for or how many were actually sold.
So as I mentioned before, Parker guns were made in a variety of different grades. Now you'll see, if you read about Parker guns, you might see a reference that says dollar guns. When they first started making Parker guns, they didn't actually grade them at that point. They actually set a dollar value. So, you know, there was like a $50 gun, a $100 gun, a $150 gun, which was a lot of money in those days. One grade worth mentioning is the Invincible. That was the very highest grade that Parker made. Now, only 3 Invincibles were ever made. They cost, I can't remember how much they cost at the time, but it was like a huge amount of money. And I think the first one was the 200,000th gun, was serial number 200,000, and there was 2 more. They made them for specific people or reasons. I can't really remember the details.
All 3 Invincibles are displayed together at the NRA National Firearms Museum in Virginia.
And apparently they, if they were to come up for sale, which they probably never will, but if they were to come up for sale today, it's estimated each one would bring about $3 million.
As well as the embellishment, engraving, wood grain and fit and finish, the other thing that varies between the different grades of Parker guns is the steel made in the barrels. They seem to make a big deal about different types of steel. Some of them are imported, some of them American. In the early days you had a choice of various types of Damascus barrels as well, but I'll just go through these different types of steel. The very highest grade guns had Whitworth steel imported from the Whitworth Company in England. The next level of guns had Acme steel, which I think is American made. In some of the mid-range guns you had a choice of Acme or Bernard steel. The GH grade guns were advertised with Parker Special Steel or Parker steel barrels. VH grade guns, which was the lowest grade till the Trojan was introduced, were advertised as having Vulcan steel barrels. And then when the Trojan was introduced, it was advertised as having imported Trojan steel barrels. This vise that I found on eBay is obviously made by one of Parker's companies and is branded as a Trojan. So whether he just liked to use that name or whether it's because it was actually made of this same Trojan steel, I'm not sure.
So that's pretty much the Parker story. So now we just need to go to the Trojan. Now, the Trojan, of the 200 however many thousand Parker guns that were made, the vast majority were Trojans. I think there was, well, the vast majority as far as single grades go. And of course the Trojan, so the way that they'd actually started was back in about 1910, 1912 there. They decided that they needed to kind of get into that market of somewhere where someone wanted a quality, they were prepared to pay for a quality gun, but they didn't need all the bells and whistles. And they set $25 as being a target. Now at the time the VH I think was about $50 for the base model. So they looked at how they could reduce the cost and produce a gun that was more affordable. I'll go over to my Trojan now and we'll just get the other camera and I'll just sort of show you the things that were different. Alright, let's have a look at my Parker Brothers Trojan. Now, I just have a look at the gun first, quickly. I mean, it's just a box lock shotgun. Externally, obviously, as I said, there's this kind of weird recessed hinge pin, which is typical of a Parker. You got a box lock frame, triggers there. It hasn't got the original butt plate on this, so I won't show you that. I put that butt plate on. So, but as you can see, wood's not too bad. This one has 30-inch barrels and it's choked full and full. Now we'll talk about the Trojan specifically in a minute, but just take a note of that. So let's just have a look at what makes the Trojan a Trojan compared to the other guns. Now, the gun we would be comparing it to is the VH grade, which is the lowest grade of standard
Parker gun. So you could actually buy a basic VH grade gun without any other, added options. And it would be similar to a Trojan, but what makes the Trojan different? Well, one thing is the actual design of the just the action here. I think they've made it just to minimize the amount of hand filing. Now, I'll just have a look at that, and what I'll do is I think I can find a photo of maybe a VH or a graded Parker gun, and I'll show you, and you can just compare the shape of the action. You can see that the graded guns, the action is just a bit curved around up the front where the hinge pin is. But apparently, as far as mechanicals, internally it's identical. The parts are identical. The fit and finish is identical. There's no difference in the actual quality, in inverted commas, of the gun. It's just the actual general class of the gun, I suppose, you talk about. Now, the timber in the Trojan apparently is much more basic. This timber is quite nice, I think, but yeah, the higher you grade gun, the better the timber you're going to have. The checkering is still hand checkered, but you're checkering 10 lines per inch in the Trojan, and I think if you've got a VH grade, it's probably going to be 12 or something like that. So that's one difference. Apparently the butt plates are different. Graded Parkers have butt plates with the nice Parker Brothers logo on them. The Trojan just came with a basic butt plate. This doesn't have its original butt plate. This is what the original Trojan butt plate would have looked like. Trojans were extractor only. You couldn't get ejectors with them. You just didn't have any options with the Trojan. You had a couple of barrel length options. As you can see from this advertisement, the Trojan was only available in 12, 16 and 20 gauge. In 12 gauge there was only 2 barrel options. You could have a 28-inch barrels with modified and full choke, or 30-inch barrels like mine with full choke in both barrels. And then you only had 1 barrel option for both 16 and 20 gauge. You couldn't get single trigger. Apparently very late in the Trojans they actually did put the single trigger into them, or it was an option, but in general Trojans always double trigger. No ejectors. And the other one is they don't have the King's 4-end latch. They got this 4-end with thick under here. Very common in a lot of guns. It's just spring loaded and you just pull that down and it just comes off. Now you see here, this says Parker Brothers, makers, Meriden, Connecticut, USA, Trojan steel. Imported Trojan steel. So clearly these are still high quality guns. It's not as if the steel is going to be low quality or anything like that. Another change in the Trojan is to the doll's head. Now if you don't know what a doll's head is, you see this little extension on the top of the barrel that goes into the notch in the frame. Parker guns traditionally always had a doll's head. They had a more complex one than this. It actually sort of almost a T-shaped one which helped lock the action. This photo of a graded gun gives a good view of the T-shape of the doll's head. After 1920, so only a year after this gun was made, they actually got rid of the doll's head completely, so it was straight flat across the face. You can clearly see the lack of the doll's head in this later Trojan. Now one of the most important things you'll see here on a Parker gun is these marks on top of the barrel lug. Now 12, obviously this is a 12 gauge, so that's what that means, but you'll see there's a number 1 there. So every Parker gun will have a number there. That actually corresponds to the frame size of the gun, because the guns come in multiple. There's about 8 different frame sizes, I think. And what that actually corresponds to, the frame sizes go from, I think, 000, 000, 000, 000, 0, and then 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And what that corresponds to is the actual distance between the firing pins. So a 0 frame size gun is exactly 1 inch between the firing pins, and a number 1 is it's in 1/16 of an inch. So a number 1 is 1 1/16 of an inch between the firing pins. The number 2 is 1 1/8 inch between the firing pins, etc. And same going the opposite way as well. So a 00 is going to be 1/16 less than 1 inch, whatever that works out to be. Here's a table of frame sizes. You can see the 12 gauge comes in 4 different frame sizes, but in the Trojan there was a set size. So 12 gauge was a size 1 frame, and the Trojan also came in 16, 20 and 28, which I think would have been a size 0 frame.
All the internals of the Parker Trojan are no different to any other Parker gun. That's often stressed. The Trojan's not a cheap version of a Parker gun with cheap manufacturing or cheap anything. The internal parts are still handmade and hand fitted. The design is the same. The wood to metal finish was still fitted in the same way. As I showed you, they just chose some certain things that they thought that they could use a cheaper method of doing without reducing the general quality and shootability of the gun. And these guns are really, they're well known for being well balanced and great shooters, and as you'll see, mine is as well. All that's left to do now is take the Parker Trojan out to the range and shoot a few targets. Now, before you watch this footage, just keep in mind, I'm not a shotgun shooter. I'm mainly a rifle shooter. You know, I dabble in going out and shooting a few clays every now and then, but I don't shoot clays regularly, and my technique and everything is probably not that good.
Whoa. Whoa. Bang. Whoa. 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 Whoa.
Tight choke on that gun.
What's that?
Tight choke on that gun.
Pretty heavy. It's
Because it
full
smokes them.
choke.
Smokes them if you hit it.
Yeah.
Like, not too many
yeah.
other... The other ones aren't smoking, that's
Yeah.
smoking it, so...
Yeah, it's full and full.
Yeah. Like, when people are hitting them, they're belting them, but that's smoking them.
Long way round, isn't it? Pull. 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 Pull.
Out of the total of 25 targets, I hit 18 with my first shot, which was 3 points each. That was a score of 54. 3 targets I hit with my second shot. They are scored at 1 point, so that's 3 points. And I had 4 misses for a total score of 57 out of 75. This was the highest score on the day, and I was the only shooter using a side-by-side shotgun.
So that's really just scratched the surface of the Parker Brothers gun story. There's several books that cover it in depth. Some of them are very expensive, I found. I did get one cheap one second hand, but the others are all out of my price range. But the other thing that's worth noting is there is actually a Parker Brothers collecting organisation. They've got a website, parkerguns.org. I'll put it in the description. So if you look on there, there's all sorts of information about history, grades, there's millions of photos, there's a forum, there's everything you could possibly want to know about Parker guns. When it comes to the Trojan, I've got to say there's something about the design and quality of that gun that makes it very easy to shoot. It's pretty hard to put your finger on it. I guess I'm an average sized guy, so it probably fits me quite well. But just the handling, the balance, the swing, the trigger pull, everything about it just seems to make it so effortless to hit targets. So I'm very glad that I managed to get it and was introduced to Parker Brothers guns. Special thanks to Simon for taking that great shooting footage for me. And until next time, thanks for watching.